And with that, we will open the Finance and Audit Committee, for the Metro Fire District for Thursday, August 25th, 2022. So public opportunities to discuss matters of public interest within the committee's scope, including items on or not on the agenda, are provided. Do we have any speakers?
There are no speakers here in person. Do we have anyone that needs to be unmuted?
We have a couple of attendees. I am allowing them to talk. Attendees, if there's anything you'd like to present to the board at this time, please go ahead and do so. That is a negative.
All right.
Moving then to the consent agenda.
I so move.
We have a motion. And is Director Wood available for a second?
No, he's not in attendance
Oh,
this
that's
evening.
right. Then we have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Melissa, do you want to call the roll for that?
Sure.
Okay.
Director Clark
Aye.
and Director Orzali.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Moving then to presentation items.
Good job.
Item number 1, final budget for fiscal year 2020 and 22 and 2023. Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you, Director Orzali. Thank you to all board members and Chief Harms. This evening, I'll be presenting the final budget for 22-23. And before I dive into the slides, I want to ask Chief Harms, you'd like to make any opening remarks on the budget?
Thank you, Dave. Directors, thank you. We have 3 presentations tonight. We have final budget, capital improvement program upgrade, and then kind of the final audit of or the final quarter that we had of fiscal year 21-22. I think that as far as a highlight of each one of these, if you look at final budget, we have about an 8% plus increase in property tax, which is very positive for us. About a 4.5 million surplus as we go into the year. The CIP project, as you know, is something that has been worked on with Dave and his shop and Jeff Fry and Aaron for putting all of our capital needs into one area. And so we'll have an update you on that one there. And the final, really the kind of the closeout of fiscal year 21-22, that last 2 months. As we went through the year, as you know, with COVID, we had a number of challenges, but I am happy to say that being able to do the adjustments that we did, we're probably about 2.5 or a little bit more under budget by the time we got to the end of the year. I would say the things that we put in place to be able to get through the end of the year made us successful as we move forward. So Dave, take it away.
Okay, so the agenda for tonight, I want to do a real quick preliminary budget recap to kind of as a reminder where we were 2 months ago when the board passed the preliminary budget. And then we'll go into the budget overview of all funds and then focus on the general fund revenues, expenditures, and then shift back to other fund conditions. The long-term forecast covers the current year and 5 out years. We'll do just a quick mention of the CIP and then turn it over to questions and comments. So that preliminary budget recap there, the 22-23 preliminary budget was a balanced budget for the general fund and is a balanced budget with budgeted expenditures and transfers roughly equal to the expected revenues and transfers in. The expenditures and transfers roughly equal to revenues and transfers in. The 2.1 million transferred from the general fund was used to close the mid-year shortfall, was restored and paid that back. Property tax growth at that point was 6.6%, meaning an $11.6 million increase relative to the 21-22 mid-year budget. And then finally, the year-end reserve was 13%, up from 12.5% in the mid-year. So we were already creeping up. And as I think I said back then, expected to hope to report a little bit of improvement, which we will discuss tonight on our reserve ratio. Next is the budget summary of all funds. So across the top, you have the fund names there, and then the categories on the left from top to bottom are revenues, expenditures, transfers, and then change in fund balance. Let's see, the table, this is on page 25 of your report. That's going into the row at the bottom is the fund balance projected. The first column of numbers is the general fund. So looking at that first column with the numbers circled, the first circle at the top is total general fund revenues of 257.4 million. 4 lines below that and circled is the general fund expenditures, 256.8 million. Now all the way at the bottom is change in fund balance again, which if you net out the transfers of 3.7 million, which is circled there, it results in a positive fund balance of 4.3 million, which the chief just mentioned. In the capital facilities fund, the next column over, just want to point out the expenditures are 11.6 million, which are covered by lease financing, the sale of an asset that's on station, a former fire station, and 5 million transfer from the general fund for a net balance of 587,000. We'll talk about the other funds as we get to them in this presentation, but all the way on the right, you can see that the total revenues, 279.2 million, total expenditures, all funds 281.1, and then with transfers, a net balance of 5.2 million. So let's dive right into the fund du jour, the general fund. Let's see, comparing actuals, what this general fund presentation does and all the presentations of funds, they compare the unaudited unaudited numbers as of the end of 21-22 to the final budget. So that will be the comparison for all these presentations. Let's see, this is on page 33 of your report. So starting with property taxes, the circled row at the top there, the expected property tax revenues in 22-23 are 189.3 million. That's a $14.7 million increase of approximately 7.6%. And that's 1% more than the 6.6% I just mentioned a minute ago. So even between prelim and where we are now, we're seeing a 1% increase, and that's basically because of what the assessor reported in July, and working with our property tax consultant, we came up with that number. Looking at the next circled oval row, the total revenues, adding in other revenue sources like charges for services provided, such as medic fees, and total revenues will climb nearly 20.7 million over last fiscal year to 257.4 million. The proposed budget reflects a $5 million increase in labor costs relative to those unaudited figures in last year, and to 215.1 million. Services and supplies are to grow by 4.2 million over last year to 37.2 million. Without factoring in transfers, final revenues are above by 590,000, are above expenditures by 590,000. And then with those transfers, that balance again is 4.3 million.
Cool.
This next slide is a familiar one. Let's see, that's on page 4 of the final budget. The fiscal year 22-23 is expected to be the 10th consecutive year of property tax growth and the 12th consecutive year of total revenue growth. Property tax revenues as a share of general fund revenues has declined slightly by about 5% since 2010-11, is now projected to be about 74% of the total district revenues in 22-23. As you can see in the other revenues share, that's the darker row there. It's expanding with more EMS revenues, and IGT transfers have largely made that up. A little more on general fund revenues. The district expects to see a 7.6% property tax increase, as mentioned. Medic transport revenues will grow about 2% or 1.6 million to 47 million in the budget year in 22-23. GMT, the program where we received partial state reimbursement for medic transports of Medi-Cal beneficiaries, we expect to receive back payments for the last 4 years, approximately 4 million in 22-23. There may be more to report on GMT in the coming months, as the program will be overhauled significantly effective January 1. On IGT, the net IGT revenues are down slightly from last year, about 700,000 to 8.7 million. The State Department of Healthcare Services advises us to expect changes to that program next year, including possible a smaller group of participating managed care providers. So that's why we have that shrinkage, about 700,000. And we'll be monitoring the changes to that program closely and report back if there's something more significant than that. Finally, the projected revenue reserves, as of June 30th, 2023. So we expect to have on that date is budgeted to be 35.9 million or 13.7%. So that's 0.7% more than the 13 I mentioned that we budgeted, anticipated when we presented the preliminary budget. And of course, the reserve will be updated in March 2023 with a mid-year budget. And will include the unspent funds from 21-22. And while the exact figure won't be known until the annual audit is completed around December, there will be additional unspent funds from 21-22 to recognize in the mid-year. And subject to new expenditures, those unspent funds can be used to increase the size of reserve or other spending priorities such as purchases without financing. Next slide. This is the expenditures pie chart. Labor costs are still a large part of the budget. No surprise there, 82.1%. Service and supplies are 14.2%, and taxes, licenses, debt service, and transfers make up less than 4%. Turning and looking at the labor part of the expenditures, again, it's 215.1 million. All wage costs will grow by 4.4% or 6.1 million, reflecting both the 4% wage increase, new positions, natural growth through promotions, and savings carried over, underspending in the prior year, 21-22. Pension contributions will tick up by 5.3 million. Recall that the windfall market returns reported last summer won't be reflected in premiums for 2 fiscal years, meaning we'll see that benefit next year. PERS OPEB contributions, on the other hand, have only a 1-year lag for market returns, so we saw a $2.2 million savings there. And constant staffing, as mentioned earlier, is budgeted to return to pre-pandemic levels, a savings of 3.6 million relative to the prior year. And reflecting the decline in COVID cases, we expect workers' comp claims to subside. It's a savings of about 1 million. Some of the labor changes. Looking at services and supplies, approximately the total service and supplies budget again is 37.2 million, 4.2 million over the unaudited 21-22 figure. Liability insurance premiums are rising again by about 744,000. Education and training services are going up mainly because staff who deferred that training are starting to take that training again during we deferred it during the height of the pandemic, that is. There's also some inflationary and supply chain increases sprinkled through the service and supplies budget. So vehicle maintenance is expected to go up by 354,000, computer services by 260,000. Last kind of category of expenditures, general fund debt service assessments and contributions, they total 4.6 million, and we'll pay the county 1.9 million for property tax admin. We'll also pay 1.9 million to the state for GEMT QAF program, an expense that gets offset and then some by Medicare reimbursements through EMS. General fund debt service payments on lease revenue bonds are at 259,000, which actually reflects a $53,000 savings due to the refinancing that was effective in 21-22. A minute on capital outlay. This slide summarizes capital outlay spending from the Capital Facilities Fund, the Development Impact Fee Fund, and federal grants. It ties to the capital outlay summary found on page 31 of your report. Some, but not all, the items shown on this page are shown in the CIP. A crucial distinction is that CIP items must have a cost of at least 50,000 and the useful life of more than 1 year. The key items included in that capital outlay summary are the Copter 3 conversion, just to mention a few, 6 ambulance remounts at 1.2 million, and then fleet service pickups at 200,000. Another issue I want to bring to light, because it's not shown on your report yet, is the 4 additional procurements that will be reflected in the final budget presented in 2 weeks. So because of the unprecedented supply chain delays that we were not anticipated to take possession of those items in the budget year. However, there will be contract commitments and financial commitments that we want to reflect anyway in this fiscal year. So we're going to add those to the final budget. Those items are listed there. 3 ambulances, 5 Type 1 engines, 1 Type 5 engine, and Vineyard Springs station design. See. Let's see. Any unspent capital facilities fund will be retained in the capital facilities fund to be proposed for repurposing in the mid-year budget or the 23-24 budget. Leaving the general fund and starting to look at the other funds, we'll go into that capital facilities fund, the budget presentation there, with the actuals, unaudited, and preliminary, final, and variance across the top, and the revenue, expenditures, and other financing categories on the left. The display shows the capital facilities fund expenditures of 11.6 million, funded by 6.6 million in capital leases or financing, 630,000 from the sale of a property asset, the old station 68, and a $5 million transfer from the general fund. The balance of 587,000 is circled there at the bottom. The one major expenditure change relative to 21-22 is the lease financing bond retirement, which is reflected as a special item and offset in the issuance of capital leases. That's circled there too. Next fund is the grant fund. The total grant revenues are anticipated to grow by almost 4.5 million to 4.9 million. That's due to a surge in intergovernmental grants related to the SAFER program. Total grant expenditures will shrink slightly from 5.5 million to just over 5 million. Grant funded labor costs will grow 1.3 million to 4.4 million, reflecting again expenditures from SAFER. Factoring in transfers, the expected balance is negative 112,000, a gap that will be closed using available fund balances in that fund. The leased properties fund is leased properties rental income revenue is expected to be approximately 1.1 million in 22-23, about the same as last year. Expenditures will grow by about 500,000 relative to the unaudited numbers in 21-22, reaching 1.1 million. Projected balance is negative 24,000, which will be covered using available balances in that fund. So that is the general fund budget and the funds. Want to move on to the forecast part of the presentation. Excuse me. In the next few slides, we'll take a look at where the final budget leads us. So we're adding 5 additional years. Yes.
Just a question, going back to this, to the reference to the 700,000 plus in insurance. Is there, if that represents an increase over last year by 700,000?
Yes.
And is there, not that we can do anything about it, but there's nothing to make us think that that won't continue to increase?
Yeah, Chief, you want to go for that one? I'm
Yeah,
not
so
involved in
actually in
negotiations.
my presentation tonight, we met with the other company that bid on our insurance, and their name was Farah. And if you remember, we were down to the end of the line there, and it was a difference about $1.5 million, but we had a lot of concerns about the coverage versus the coverage that we have with FDRMA. And so we met actually 2 weeks ago with Farah and started the process, and Brad Savizin, what is it? Citizen. We all met to be able to start that process so that we will be able to compare the coverage we have with SDRMA along with the coverage that Farah is being able to bring forward. And I really do think there is going to be an opportunity for them to be very competitive, just as they were before, plus that we have the equal amount of coverage that we do currently with SDRMA by being able to get out of the SDMRA pool, which is cities and folks and a lot of law enforcement, and being able to get into a pool that is just the fire service is going to have a significant positive impact on us. And like I said, last year it was about 1.2 million, but we just couldn't pull the trigger on that one.
Thank you, Chief. Please continue.
Okay. So I wanted to cover the assumptions in the long-term forecast. Let's see, on some of the revenues related assumptions are, we used our property tax consultants projections that we mentioned in this presentation already. IGT was not changed over the period, just assumed it would stay flat, which is the same assumption we used last year for the forecast. On the expenditure side, the forecast assumes 1% annual increase in salaries. Last year's forecast was 0, so we just plugged in a 1%. Recall that labor costs are 82% of the budget, and wages are about 33% of that, so about 28% of the budget. Wages are, so adding percentages of wage increase can make a big difference in the forecast. And that's why I use a kind of a modest, just tester of 1%. Pension costs share between the employer and employee don't change. It's the same as last year. And then inflation assumed an 8.3% inflation rate for 22-23. That's based on the most recent Bureau of Labor Statistics data. Then stepping down at 1% as the federal rate change impacts phase in. So, and then on the borrowing rate, we increased it to 4.5% in 22-23, and then in 23 and in 23-24, and then it gradually steps down by about 0.5% a year. as a it's stepping down by 0.5% a year as the Fed's rate changes gradually back down the rate increases. So I'll give you the assumptions. We'll move on to the actual forecast. A few slides here. Excuse me. Revenues and expenditures. This is again looking 5 years back and 5 years forward relative to the 22-23 year. The circle on the left there, you can see that the red line, which is the expenditures, is slightly ahead of revenue. So it's showing what we saw in the mid-year, and we had to balance that with transfers and reductions in spending. In 22-23, it flips back to where we normally see it, and you can see it going further to the right. That green line, the difference between the green line and the red, kind of builds up over time, and that's largely due to property tax revenues, of course. This next slide shows pension obligation bond payments over the same period. You can see that the POB payments reduced starting in 25-26, saving approximately $4 million a year, and there's another savings of $3 million the next year. Looking at reserves. The vertical blue bars are the ending general fund reserve balance for the designated fiscal year. The red line is the general fund reserve ratio, which you can read to the right side column. The green line represents the 15% reserve benchmark. And notice that in 21-22, we got down to about 12.5%, as mentioned earlier, after the mid-year. And then in 22-23, it's going to climb up to 13.7%, the second circle. And then if the forecast holds the 15% standard minimum expectation of this board, it gets reacquired next year and then climbs from there. That steep climb, which is hard to miss on this slide, it has to do with factors like POB payments ending, like we just showed in the prior slide, which mean space to invest more in other needs like capital projects, reducing pension and OPEB debt and things of that nature. Capital improvement program, just added this slide in there to underscore the point that there's a separate agenda item coming on CIP, but the two are interrelated, and the information, the numbers, information, descriptions of both are complementary and overlapping. Before doing questions and comments, just I wanted to mention a couple of things. Of course, this is a presentation item only for the Finance and Audit Committee. My recommendation would be to receive and file. And a couple things on the budget outside of the numbers we just talked about. The narratives in the preliminary budget have been substantially revamped to include not only divisional background and recent achievements, but also performance measures and goals for the upcoming year. The final budget also includes more budget context and process detail, including a description of the economic environment affecting the district. It includes out-year forecasts like that we just looked at, and how we match up budgetarily to a comparable fire district. These enhancements are intended to improve the overall readability and context of the report. And Finance will, for the first time, be submitting this to the CSM, the California Society of Municipal Finance Officers, for their Excellence Award. That's really the top tier budgeting award in the state. And of course, I want to thank the finance team who works on this for their support, especially Tara Mailer, Sarah Ortiz, and Ron Empedred. So with that, I close and invite any questions and comments.
I have it.
Thank you for this. And as you know from our previous conversations, I had a couple of questions that were brought to me by Director Jones. And so with that, as we spoke earlier, on page 6 is a reference that reflects 9.2% increase in labor costs. And with the 4% that was approved by the board this year, that leaves a seeming delta of 5.2%. How do we account for that?
Sure. And so the really a few factors. There's in the 9%, there's the wage growth, the 4%. But there are also wage savings in 21-22 that reduced the starting point. So you did have a higher jump because we had savings in 21-22. It starts as a lower base, so it looks like a bigger jump than it would otherwise be. Because, and then we also budget for all positions to be filled in 22-23. So that inflates that figure as well. because the reality, of course, is not every position is filled every day. And then we also have natural wage growth related to promotions and step increases and that. So that also increases the number.
Okay. Also, this was a general observation that in looking at the budget, seems to be a lot of shifting funds from one budget to another. It's a pretty common practice, but the concern was that we were doing a lot of it more recently. Is there some contributing factor that causes us to be doing more adjusting?
The adjustments of the recent adjustments that I think maybe referring to would be in the mid-year, and
Yes.
the reason there were so many adjustments at the mid-year is because in the past, of course, without going over what happened in the mid-year, the constant staffing was way up. Let's just start with that. That was a big expenditure factor that we hadn't built in fully into the budget. So we needed to find funds elsewhere. In the past, we could typically go to the IGT fund, and that was pretty regular to be able to shift funds to the IGT fund, which would normally have a balance of about almost 9.7 million, I think. However, there was a change in the IGT fund last year that happens at the state level and how they were going to pay us. And so we were delayed in receiving payments. They shifted everything by effectively 6 months. So that money got pushed into this fiscal year. So we didn't, or not all of it, about 2/3 of it got pushed into the next fiscal year. So we didn't have as much of that IGT funds to shift to move over. So it was necessary to make more transfers, and we made transfers over, I don't have the numbers at my fingertips, but around $1 million from the leased properties fund, from the capital facilities financing fund, and some portion from the IGT fund, I believe, as well. So in that way, there were more transfers, but it was largely due to the fact that we didn't have the IGT funds to transfer from as we typically do.
Okay, thank you. And the last point was regarding the new fire and medical vehicles that we have ordered, that the money is allocated in this year's budget. However, we're not paying for those until next year. So where will those funds be transferred or held over for next year's budget?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right.
And if something happens, we get no more information, between the final and the mid-year, we can of course update things in the mid-year, but that typically, the answer is yes. It doesn't happen to hold over.
Thank you. So in this process, when we take possession of those, do we pay that in one lump sum for those vehicles? So next year, the money gets held over this year, and then next year, that money will go to the manufacturers in one lump payment.
Yeah, whether we're financing it, they'll receive the full amount, and then we will pay the finance portion over a series of typically 5 years.
Okay, and
If we don't finance it, then they receive one lump payment.
I guess that's one of the other questions is, do we anticipate that we'll be financing those vehicles?
Which is,
Yeah, the answer is yes. Most, I'm not aware of an exception off the top of my head, but most vehicles we do finance. I don't know, Aaron, do you have any?
I don't deal with the financing,
Okay.
but yes,
Doesn't come to mind.
I believe so.
Okay, great. Thank
so
you
it
so
won't
much.
be in a lump sum then, right? We won't pay in a lump sum since we're financing.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, that clears.
So, moving to the capital improvement plan. Mr. O'Toole.
Thank you. Thank you again. So on June 9th, the board of this year, the board of directors gave final approval to the district's first capital improvement program plan, a $9.1 million plan for capital projects in 22-23. Similar to our budget process, we've received new project and funding information. Now brings us back to you for consideration of the updated CIP plan for this fiscal year. little bit of this reminder. This is what the cover of the CIP looks like, of course. The CIP plan was prepared in accordance with the capital improvement program policy approved by the board of directors in February this calendar year, and in accordance with standards established by the California Society of Municipal Finance Officers and generally accepted accounting principles. The costs presented in the plan are tied to and reflected in the 22-23 budget. So getting into the differences, what we'll be proposing is when we presented the plan again in June, the total spending was 9.1 million in 12 projects. Here we have 17 projects totaling 8.8 million and 24.7 million in total project costs. This is on table page 14 of your report. The CIP plan is built not only on funds available in 22-23, but also additional revenue projections and anticipated debt issuances in subsequent fiscal years. The next slide, this table is found on pages 16 and 17. It shows the project name, a description, funding sources and amounts, and shares of the 8.8 million in planned CIP expenditures. Some projects have more than one fund source. Boardroom equipment, for example, includes both general fund and capital facilities. So to look at the table in the next two slides, the first four items are equipment related: boardroom equipment, replacement turnouts, helmets, and turnouts for recruits. The next two are apparatus, 6 ambulance remounts, and service vehicles. Next page, we've got 3 more apparatus packages are shown: Copter 3 conversion, various apparatus vehicle replacements, including ambulances, 2 Type 5 engines, water tender, and utility vehicles. There are 4 facilities projects now: refurbishment of the old Station 68, dorm lockers, privacy walls for older stations, headquarters roof replacement, and Station 23 temporary restroom trailer. And there are new construction items on the list as well: planning for the Vineyard Spring Station and a new Station 68 patio covering. And finally, there's a land acquisition item for Grant Line 220 in Rancho Cordova. Updated funding recommendations on the debts for debt service. On page 20 of the plan, it shows that the debt service over the 5-year period for the project selected in this year's plan. The financing shown includes everything that will be paid for more than 1 fiscal year through bank financing or bonds. And again, this table will be adjusted for the full board to reflect the additional projects that involve financing. The district is pursuing ways to shift away from financing apparatus purchases, and we'll be talking more about that later. So this was just a pretty short update, relatively small changes. Didn't want to go over the whole CIP presentation again, but just want to clarify again that there will be these changes to the CIP to reflect the updated financing plans and projects. This is a receive and file item only, and Aaron Castleberry is here to answer any questions related to the projects themselves. And with that, I invite your questions and comments.
I have no questions.
Good report.
So moving then to the third part of the Dave O'Toole show,
Thank you.
finance report through June 30th, 2022.
Let's wait for the report to come up. There we go. Thank you. Good evening again. Tonight's bi-monthly fiscal report presents fiscal trends to assist you in monitoring the health of the district. This is the last bi-monthly report for 21-22, including data from the final 2 months of last fiscal year. It's drawn from the Finance Committee report, which you've previously been provided. Next, the first slide chart is cash balance trends as of the end of the fiscal year. The trend line follows a historical pattern where we spend into the dry period and borrow from the county is necessary until the property tax revenue transfers boost our cash reserve back up. The green line is prior year, red line is current year. And you can see that we track closely in the second half of the year, and the ending cash balance was almost 62.3 million. That's actually 2.5 million better than we finished last year. Total revenues. This shows that in 21-22, the district again tracked closely to expected general fund revenues, including taxes, service charges, and medical cost revenues. There are 3 lines in this chart. Again, green is prior year, red is current year, and blue is the budgeted revenues as adjusted in the mid-year budget. Actual revenues from all sources in 21-22 were 257.6 million, about 1.5 million more than forecasted mid-year budget. That's a 6% difference. We received 177.9 million in property taxes by June 30th, which was about 1.3% above where we anticipated in the mid-year budget and 6% more than the end of 2021. Sticking with revenues and turning to medic cost revenues, the red line is the current year again, green is prior, and blue is budgeted. Total anticipated annual medic cost revenue as adjusted by the mid-year budget was 45.6 million. At the end of June, we were just shy of that, 45.3 million, which you can see as the red and blue lines are practically coterminous. As final budget reconciliations occur, we'll see that gap close even further. Overall medic revenues are 2.3 million over last year's revenues. Again, that is of course somewhat attributable to COVID quarantining that occurred the prior year that suppressed ambulance transports and revenues. Next, we'll turn to the expenditure side, total expenditures. After 12 months, the general fund expenditures relative to our updated mid-year budget were just about 4.3 million apart, with actuals coming in under the mid-year budgeted amount. Some of that, of course, is timing, and that gap will narrow with final budget reconciliations. Actual expenditures through June were 254 million and equated with 98.3% of the total annual expenditure budget. So came in a little bit shy of the spending level we anticipated. Relative to last fiscal year, expenditures at the end of June 2022 were 7.3%, or 14.3 million higher than this year. That's mainly because we experienced a rise in services and supplies costs as well as labor costs. Looking at the labor cost piece, let's see, on this slide, the blue is budget, red is actual, and green again is prior. You can see that after 12 months, the labor costs tracked fairly close to the mid-year budgeted number, with actuals 2.5 million less than the mid-year projection. By the end of June, employee wages remained high relative to prior year, a difference of 15 million due to hiring, compensation increases, and constant staffing callbacks. And then we'll look at general fund reserves. Okay. Again, here is the green line is prior, red is current. For this fiscal year as a whole, we followed a course similar to last year. Reserves at the end of June were considerably higher than last year end by 6.1 million and calculated to be 14.7%. Those figures are subject to final reconciliations and costs still, but that's where we ended on that date. And looking at the CERT fund, the California Employers Retirement Benefit Trust, which is used to offset future OPEB liabilities. This is not a cash fund, and monies in this trust may only be used to pay for OPEB-related costs, mainly retiree health. The total shown at the top, 66.1 million, is made up of contributions over the life of participation in the fund and investment earnings. That number is actually 3.4 million less than when I reported 2 months ago, and $6.4 million less than when I reported 4 months ago, reflecting how the market slowdown is eroding the benefits that are the earnings that we've received and through the CERT fund. You can see that in the green, kind of at the very right, the green line going down. So with an overall liability of 243.9 million for 21-22, by the end of the year, we were 26% funded, which is 4% lower than what I reported 4 months ago. CalPERS is communicating that they're adjusting their investments and watching the market closely, but of course, we need to watch and monitor closely too. The last slide is the takeaways for this report. Importantly, the mid-year solutions held. The actions that you took in February and March balanced the budget and realigned us for savings and be in a good position for 22-23. Ending cash balances improved from 21-22. We're at 2.5 million above. Final expenditures were 4.3 million below the mid-year budget, with final reconciliations still to occur. Labor expenditures were 2.5 million below the mid-year budget, mostly due to constant staffing savings, with final reconciliation still to occur. And on the downside, CERT performances obviously has been following the market trends and not performing as well as we might have hoped. So with that, this is again a presentation item only. My recommendation is to receive and file. And then, like, any comments or questions?
I'm good.
Seeing no questions, thank you so much for the report. And it's always a pleasure to have you reports come in.
Appreciate that.
I know what a nuisance they can be, but we really appreciate the effort.
Thank you.
With that, the Financial Audit Committee is next scheduled to meet on September 22nd. Board clerk is aware that I will be traveling. And so seeing no further business, any other items to discuss?
I don't think so.
This meeting is adjourned.